Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger with your daily video update for today, which is June 29th, 2022. The NATO summit is beginning in Madrid today. This is being described as a transformational event by NATO leaders as they're preparing for a bigger war in Europe, possibly a global war with the expansion of NATO to be a global force. It's going to begin today, but there are already developments as there was an agreement reached with Turkey yesterday to clear the way for the approval of Finland and Sweden to be new members of NATO. And this will extend extensively, nearly double the border between NATO and Russia, and put NATO forces potentially directly on the border with Russia. NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg, in a flight-forward, bragging mode, yesterday talked about how Russia and China are threats to NATO's values and the rule of law. Now, one wonders when he talks about that, as Blinken talks about the rules-based order, does that include the U.S. policy of funding and supporting the terrorists in a civil war in Syria? The UN Human Rights Commission just announced that there have been 307,000 Syrian civilians killed in that civil war, which was a regime change effort by the United States with some backing of NATO powers. Is that the rule of law that Stoltenberg is talking about? How about the starvation of children in Afghanistan and Yemen? How about the destruction of Libya through a NATO operation? And on and on and on. That's hardly an advertisement for a rules-based order. I think it's encapsulated very brilliantly in an article by Caitlin Johnstone, headlined, quote, "Empire to expand NATO in response to a war caused by NATO expansion," unquote. The issue that she's addressing is that it was not Putin's desire for expanding the so-called Russian Empire that led to the fighting in Ukraine, because Putin was trying to gain security guarantees to protect Russia, whose security has been threatened by the consistent expansion of NATO eastward. Now they're talking about increasing the size, the scope, and the cost of NATO. On the agenda will be the agreement to have an increase in their rapid deployment force from 40,000 troops to 300,000 troops. Maybe that's a solution to the unemployment that's about to hit Germany, where companies such as BASF and the auto companies are expecting layoffs due to energy shortages. They're also talking about deployment of more NATO vessels, a buildup of such operations as the military hospital in Ramstein. On top of that, the plans for global NATO, which includes confronting China on the other side of the globe, which is hardly part of the North Atlantic world. They're going to be discussing NATO's new strategic concept. And besides the increase in forces on the ground, they're going to talk about a boost to NATO's ability to supply and reinforce the expanded forces, to upgrade forward deployment capabilities, including air defense, and agree to a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, on top of the tens of billions already forwarded in weapons systems and support for the government. Now, this is coming despite the release of three damning sets of reports that show that this is something that NATO and the West really can't do. First, you have from the UK, and I've reported on this the last couple of days, articles confirming a breakdown of logistical and supply capabilities due to the decline of the industrial capacity to produce not only consumer goods, but also weapons and ammunition. The capability is no longer there in the West, and they're running out of ammunition to supply to Ukraine. Secondly, there's a CNN report that the Biden administration now doubts Ukraine's ability to succeed in the war with Russia, despite massive assistance. The problem is, who's going to convince Zelensky to back down after he's been puffed up as the savior of democracy in the Western world by the leaders who will be meeting in Madrid? And the third report is in Politico Europe, on the role of Boris Johnson, who hopefully will soon be out of office, although don't expect a better replacement because it is, after all, the United Kingdom. But Johnson was reported to have strongly urged Zelensky during his recent visits to Ukraine to keep the fighting going, even though Ukraine is suffering tremendous losses of personnel and physical capability. And then he also intervened to try to discourage Macron from seeking a negotiated settlement. So the idea of continuing a war which they know that cannot be won, with an inability to supply the forces and troops they're talking about increasing, shows the absolute insanity of these Western leaders as they carry on their string of summits from the EU, the G7, and now NATO. Further, you have the problem of runaway inflation. Now, this was declared in her broken English by Vice President Harris to be the highest priority for the Biden administration. Well, that should be a real confidence booster, given that they failed so far in addressing successfully any of its other high priority concerns, whether it's about border security, whether it's about the decline in infrastructure, or even about the confrontation with Russia in Ukraine. Now, it's in this context that we're announcing a new initiative, the Schiller Institute. We've issued a draft call for an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods system. And this will be released hopefully within the next 24 hours on the schillerinstitute.com website with the names of 100 initiating VIP signers. It starts by asserting the obvious, that the neoliberal economic system is bankrupt and breaking down and threatening hundreds of millions of lives in the advanced sector and up to billions of lives in the developing sector. Instead of addressing this, we point out that they're escalating the confrontation with Russia and China at a moment when Russia and China are offering inclusive alternatives for reorganizing the financial system with support from much of the rest of the world. Instead, NATO in the West is planning on increasing its confrontation with Russia and China for their unwillingness to stick to a, quote, rules-based order, unquote, which is collapsing under their feet. There's also now motion toward a new financial system, new monetary system coming from the BRICS countries, from the Eurasian Economic Union, from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, many of the nations in the global south, which have been victims of the post-colonial era of neo-colonial looting, are moving toward breaking with the dollar system, or at least looking for an alternative which can provide for the needs of their populations. So then the call includes the solutions. Global bankruptcy reorganization, starting with the idea of no bailouts for speculators. Let them eat their losses. Banning derivatives trading, which is part of the process of the bailouts that have led to the inflation from zero interest credit to the speculators from the central banks. But as we have no bailouts for the speculators, we must have debt reorganization and or forgiveness for the poorer nations which have been victimized by cheap labor and cheap raw materials to keep the bubble going in the West. This also includes a return to a fixed exchange system, away from the floating exchange rate system, which was inaugurated in August 1971. This would be based on agreements among sovereign governments, based on setting currencies with some backing of something physical, that is, an ability to back the debts which will be incorporated in the future for physical economic development. That is, if you invest in something that produces physical goods or increases your capability to increase the productivity of labor, that's not a worthless debt that needs to be backed up by free money. That's something of real value. And that can be negotiated among sovereign nations. And finally, taking away the power of private central banks to control credit and currency. So this is spelled out in the Schiller Institute call. It's now going to be posted sometime within hopefully the next 24 hours. I urge you to go to the schillerinstitute.com website, read through it, discuss it. If you have questions on it, take it up with whoever you talk to in the Schiller Institute or the Reorganization, or send your questions to me, because this Friday I'll have another question session where I'll take your questions. So that's basically my report for today, and I will be back with you tomorrow.